Welcome to another Sidebar conference. I'm Lawyers Weekly reporter Kris Olson. Well, the beginning of a school year always brings with it some anxiety for students and teachers alike, but of course the COVID-19 pandemic has taken that to a whole new level, and that means some legal issues. And with me to discuss some of those is Marc Terry. He is a partner at Mirick O'Connell, Massachusetts law firm, and he heads up the public education practice there. Welcome, Marc.
Good morning. Thank you for having me, Kris.
So obviously, a large part of your practice involves counseling public school clients. What types of things have they been bringing to your desk?
You know, a lot of angst, for sure. You know, the number of issues that have come up probably goes well beyond what we could have anticipated at the beginning. I think the biggest problems right now, as school districts try to get into reopening mode and try to open up in the fall, is trying to figure out how their staff are going to come back. You know, they've all been obligated to come up with models that they're using, which are either in-person models where all the kids come back, all the staff come back. Not many people are doing that. Or hybrid models where there's sort of a reduced number of students in the building at any given time. That certainly is the prevailing approach here in Massachusetts. And then there's the full remote model, which means just online learning and some variation of what was going on in the spring from March through June. And those issues really, they're complicated. The challenge for particularly the hybrid model is how many employees do you have that are trying to work remotely because they've got pre-existing medical conditions, or somebody in their family has got pre-existing medical conditions. And they're worried. You know, they're worried about if they come to school and they're exposed to a larger number of people, that they're going to get sick, or they're going to bring it home and their family member will get sick. So I think that has been one of the biggest barriers and one of the biggest concerns, to try to figure out how to have enough people to actually do the teaching when you have some students in person. And what goes along with that, of course, is a lot of health and safety concerns. You know, buildings, are they ready? Are they going to be safe? What kind of preventative measures are going to be put in place to limit the spread? And we're all familiar with things like 6 feet apart, wear a mask, and masks are required in school buildings. So there's certainly a lot of concern around that, but there aren't a lot of there's no specific standing guidance that's been in place that really tells us how to do this. So folks are figuring out as they go, certainly looking at guidance from Massachusetts has a number of different guidances they put out. I believe other states have done the same. And some of those are mandatory, some of those are recommended. And ultimately, that really presents a lot of challenges. And when I say challenges, I'm assuming in some respect, for here in Massachusetts, almost every teacher, every traditional school district has a teachers union. And so these are things that, and we may get into this a little bit as we go along, really have to be negotiated with unions. And I think that's really where we're at right now, is school districts are trying to negotiate agreements under which the parties can agree to how staff will come back and how school will be run.
So you bring up the union. Let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, here in Massachusetts, one of the issues that's come up is that the union is very concerned that a lot of these school buildings are old, and they worry about the ventilation systems and whether they are, sufficient to keep students and staff safe, which, of course, is a important concern. But the teachers union has gone so far as to say that teachers should refuse to go back to school if this isn't addressed. So in your view, can school districts force teachers to come back to the classroom?
Yeah, I think the straight answer is I think they can. You know, that the existing relationships in the unionized workforce there's in-school learning. That's, if this was an ordinary year, everybody would expect that teachers would be coming back, and they wouldn't have the choice, unless they just want to resign their employment, to not come back. So what you're really talking about is, could a group of teachers basically collectively decide not to show up? And that's really a strike. That's a work stoppage. Work stoppages are not permitted under the state labor relations statute here in Massachusetts. So when you think about it, I look at it and say, yeah, if you want to force the issue, the school district wants to say everybody's coming back, I think they can do that. Obviously, most school districts share the same concerns about safety as their employees do. And so everybody's working to try to find the same outcome. But if push came to shove and the only answer was, well, we're going to have people come back to school and it's going to be a fight, I think a school district could insist upon that.
Sure. Of course, these are employees at the end of the day, and that means that, among other things, the Family Medical Leave Act applies to them. How does that play into this whole scenario?
Yeah, the Family Medical Leave Act is certainly a factor, but it's actually not the biggest. So the Family Medical Leave Act talks about if you want to take time off to because you had a child and you have a newborn to take care of, and it's relevant if you have a serious health condition at home, either your own or an immediate family member, which is really a spouse, a child, a parent. So if you have somebody who's ill and needs care, or you're ill and you need to stay home, that's where the FMLA comes into play. The one that's really, and I alluded to it a little before, the one that's presenting more challenges is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, or Relief Act, excuse me. I call it FFCRA, so I may have actually gotten the last part of that wrong. But the FFCRA, which Congress passed in the spring, really creates a different issue. And in particular, people don't worry so much about trying to comply when people are sick. They don't want them in the building. If somebody has coronavirus, nobody wants them there. But the bigger challenges really are around people who, as I alluded to before, have been told that they are more likely to suffer severe outcomes if they actually contract the coronavirus. And then that's one part of it, which provides for some relief. But probably the bigger part is school closures and lack of childcare. So there's a provision in that law that says if school is closed, and that can include not having in-person learning. So you think about it this way: I'm a teacher, my kids are on a different rotation in their school district. There's no care there. So the teacher may have to stay home with the kids. Now that puts the school district in a difficult spot of how do we staff? And so that's really the challenge right now is we talked about making sure we have enough staff and balancing staff needs for leave and time off that's protected by law against the need to try to teach students. And I think as the next step beyond that is certainly the Americans with Disabilities Act. So employees who have underlying medical conditions of their own, asthma, diabetes, again, anything that has been determined to put them at a heightened risk. You know, there's a complicated analysis there, and I think from a legal perspective, because we're talking to lawyers, there's probably a good argument that you don't have to offer somebody an indefinite accommodation until a vaccine comes or the disease is eradicated. That's an indefinite leave, and the courts are pretty consistent saying you don't have to do that. But school districts don't want to fire their teachers; they really don't. And so what we're looking at a lot of times is we may not have to accommodate that, but we recognize they have a legitimate medical issue. We want to accommodate that. We'll give them a leave of absence. If we have the ability, we'll have them teach remotely. That's probably where more of the activity and concern is than under the FMLA. In fact, the Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Labor, in its guidance was very clear in saying that just an increased vulnerability to symptoms does not qualify somebody as having a serious health condition under the FMLA.
As if this weren't complicated enough, at least here in Massachusetts, our governor has instituted certain travel restrictions. If you travel out of state, you're supposed to either quarantine 14 days when you come back into the state, or produce a test within the last 72 hours that's negative for COVID-19. How does this affect the reopening of schools?
Yeah, as soon as the travel order came out, the August 1st one, the one that went into effect August 1st, I got calls from school districts saying, I've got people on vacation all over the place. And what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to make sure that we're ready to open in a few weeks, or we might have people. And I have some school districts that typically come back in the middle of August. They would already be back now. And so this was a very immediate issue for them. And so it does complicate things. I think the thing that I certainly suggested to school districts then was get some communication out to your staff to make them aware of the obligations under the travel order, so they can take the steps. They, the staff, can take the steps to be ready to go and to articulate the school district's expectation. Everybody's going to be ready to go whenever that first day of school is. The one thing that you didn't mention overviewing that travel order that I think is important is, although there's the choice of getting a test 72 hours in advance, or quarantining. Somebody can be released from quarantine if they get a negative test after they get back. So if I came back and I was 3 days into my quarantine and I can get a test, as soon as the test result comes back negative, I'm released from quarantine. Of course, the challenge is getting your test results quickly.
All kinds of fun stuff. So recent reporting in Massachusetts says that at least 70% of school districts are, at least at the moment, going to try to give a shot to reopening in-person classes to some degree. Like you said earlier, a lot of them are going with the hybrid model, 2 days in, 2 days out, that kind of thing. But just opening the school buildings and welcoming students and staff back to them means you need to get the students there, and that means buses. What sorts of complications has this presented to bus contracts in school districts?
Yeah, let me try to address the question by talking about it from a lens of bus transportation rather than just the contractors. So the biggest concern is the state guidance here on that is that basically our buses are running at something about approximately half capacity, kind of one kid per seat. So from the bus contractor's perspective, they drive the buses. Some school districts may be trying to break their runs down. So instead of doing 3 bus runs for different school levels, they now might be doing 4 or 5. I haven't seen a lot of that. The place where we really see transportation issues, one, practically speaking, reduced capacity. You'd say, all right, well, give me more buses. The school bus companies don't have more buses. There has been an issue in the sort of school bus transportation model here in Massachusetts, and I think in many places in the country, where it almost feels like there are these localized monopolies. If you go out to bid for a new bus contract, you have 4 bus companies saying, oh, let me take a look at it, and the only one that ever submits is the same one that you've used for years, unless you really tell people we're not using them again. And that's because there's a careful calibration between supply and demand there. No bus company is sitting around with 100 extra buses not being used because it costs them money. So the real challenge has been there is no ability to say, okay, well, we're going to have half as many kids on a bus. We'll just have twice as many buses. You can ask, but you won't get that. So that drives, okay, now we have other issues where you have the buses running. You're going to have sort of pragmatic operational issues around parents dropping off and clogging traffic, which is going to slow things down. The place where we're really seeing sort of transportation company battles coming up now is for those districts that are not going back hybrid, but rather are going full remote. They don't need buses, or they need a much more limited number of buses. And this kind of puts us in the same place we were in the spring, where school districts were not wanting to necessarily pay their bus companies because there are no services provided. And there's a provision in our local law, and I think it's common around the country, that you can't pay for a service that's not provided. Remember, this is public money that we're talking about. So the idea of just throwing it around and giving people money for doing nothing is something the law doesn't like. There was a provision of the special legislation that was passed in the springtime that allowed for that to be sort of a workaround, where it said, well, you can have that contract and you can pay on it, as long as it's designed to make sure buses are available when you want to go back to school. But that special provision, expired at the end of the fiscal year, which was June 30th. So we're kind of back to where we were in the springtime for those school districts that aren't necessarily using their buses right now. And I anticipate, and have had a few things come across my desk about battles over the school district saying, well, we're not using you, we're not paying you. And I think now the bus companies are trying to get more aggressive because they've got bills to pay as well. So I think that's going to be a point that's going to play out. Hopefully, for school districts' perspective, they're going to be able to find some sort of resolution similar to what happened in the spring. But I'm not sure the bus companies are going to be satisfied with that this fall.
All right, so that's one potential switch that has some budget implications. Are there other similar types of issues that are cropping up that have some districts worried about budget considerations?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, fortunately, when we started talking about the budget process in the spring, or I should say, budget process was doing fine until this all happened, and then When everything got closed down, the state started projecting shortfalls in revenue of $4 to $6 billion, which at the high end of that is double what the state had in its rainy day fund. So there's a real concern about cuts, and the early messaging was expect cuts of 10 to 20% in Chapter 70 money, which is our formula for public education. So, there's a real concern we're going to have cuts. Right now, the legislature has passed a budget for the first 4 months of the year instead of a full year that actually includes significant increases in Chapter 70. The expectation was what they called level services plus, meaning you'd have enough to do what you did last year and you're going to get more. So, in fact, school districts are seeing more money in Chapter 70 than I think they would have expected, because there's a real understanding at the state level that our economy can't open until all the parents can get back to work, and the parents can't get back to work if the kids aren't at school. But where I think we're really hitting, even with the additional money, where we're hitting problems are going to be certainly some of the supply issues, PPE, buying that. A lot of school districts are using some money to buy additional hardware, and some of that's coming from grant money that's outside the budget. I think the real thing that concerns people, and it goes back to what we were talking about before, is staffing. If you end up having a moderate-sized school district with 500 employees, 600 employees, and you're losing 75 of those to being out on some form of leave, whether it's paid or unpaid, the cost of trying to find substitutes, if you have to do that, which are impossible to find anyway, hiring other teachers while you may be providing paid leave to the ones who aren't there, you may end up paying sort of twice for what you get in terms of one person. And I think that's the sort of great unknown right now, is how many people are really going to be asking for some form of paid leave from the school district, and then the school district has to go and hire a substitute to cover that person. I think that's the biggest unknown stressor on budgets right now.
Well, it's certainly tons to think about, Mark, and I appreciate you taking a few minutes out of what I'm sure is a busy schedule to give us some insight into some of them, and I wish you the best of luck in helping your clients navigate past it.
Thank you, Kris. It's been a pleasure.